Really excited to be talking about our local wild places, our local wildlife. And when I first started in the 90s, certainly ecology, environmental science, and of course earlier than that was always seen as this, oh, who does that? We don't really, not that we don't really care, but maybe that's not what's important to us as a community and as a society. But I have seen a massive shift over the decades, and I can see the shift in the room today, so I'm really happy that you're here, and I'm really excited to speak to you about spotted-tailed quolls that myself and my group have been working on, for over a decade now. And certainly the focus of our work has always been very local. We used to be Team Quoll, Southern Highlands, but because we had so much interest, South Coast and so on, we dropped it and we're just Team Quoll now. But certainly we work all the way from southern Sydney right the way down through into the Arboreal as well. And what I personally have come to learn is that here locally, Southern Highlands, Barren Grounds, Moreton, we have got some of the most pristine forest in southeastern Australia, and everyone here is here because they know it and we want to learn more about it, so I will get going. I was approached by Southern Highlands Landcare and they said, we really want to work together. There's this great project. Do you think we could apply for some money and do something? And I said, yeah, let's do it. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I'll talk a little bit about the methods, about what we're doing, about what's been done before. So let's get into it. But before I start, I always start with an acknowledgement of country, and the University of Wollongong has got a particularly beautiful acknowledgement of country that I'd just like to read out to you. We acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by this sacred landscape, an intimate relationship with that landscape since creation, from Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from fresh water to bitter water to salt, from city to urban to rural. The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationship between all living things. The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk on, the Wild Neighbours Project itself, what's a quoll, what's a glider, the methods that we use to survey quolls and gliders, then we'll have a look a little bit at the New South Wales Bionet records, and then talk about some practical conservation that can be undertaken on your own properties. And then also how you can possibly get involved in this project. So really the purpose of the Wild Neighbours Project is that it is a community-based wildlife monitoring project focused in the Robertson, Kangaloon, Illawarra Escarpment corridor, something that's called the Thin Green Line. And if you get a chance to talk to David Rush, who's sitting just there, David has worked quite a number of years on the Thin Green Line in the area, and certainly I've worked with David over the years too, so have a chat with David about that, but I'll show you a bit more about where that is. The focus in this project is on spotted-tailed quolls and gliding possums. The reason that my group, myself, study gliding possums as well is that they are the dominant prey species of spotted-tailed quolls. So really, what we're looking at here are basic predator-prey relationships. If you've got a healthy number of prey, you're likely to have a healthy number of predators as well. And as I said, and as you know already, this is a collaboration between the Southern Highlands Landcare Network and Team Quoll, based out at the University of Wollongong. We have got funding through the local land services, and they've received support from the Australian Government's Climate Smart Agriculture program. And really this project is about strengthening community capacity to protect natural capital and biodiversity in this region. So that's what we're trying to achieve. So in the project, really what we want to do is find out where are quolls, where are these arboreal mammals, where do they occur in this local landscape, and we want to identify movement corridors. Some of you might say, oh, we already know that.
The issue that we're facing in conservation and with threatened species is that as humans alter the landscape, those movement corridors for these animals, they can shift. And so it isn't enough to know historically where these movement corridors were. You really must also have contemporary information and data so that you can feed that back into the management plans for the species. So it is a continuous process. They will change their movement patterns according to how we change the landscape. So we do have to find out where those movement patterns are, and that's what we're doing in this project primarily. The other thing that we're trying to achieve is capacity building, primarily in citizen science. So teaching the community or bringing awareness to how do we actually monitor these species? How do we collect data that is relevant and can be used? How do we identify key habitat features? If you have a look at the bottom left, who knows what they are, first of all? Hollows, yes. Do you know of what species, perhaps? Greater glider, okay. So I should have just come here. I didn't even need to collect the data then. The top one. Those particular hollows are called branch end hollows, and we've provided training to natural resource managers, forestry and so on about how to actually identify these particular types of hollows. They're not so obvious, but it's that important information and data gathering and then recognising these particular habitat features in the field that are really important in the conservation of species, because you might just think, that's just a dead branch, that's of no use to anything, when in fact it's actually a key habitat of endangered greater gliders. And then of course feeding that back into the habitat management. So coming up with maps, distribution maps like you've got there in the bottom right. And so they're Quoll sightings over the decades, starting from, I think that says 1970 all the way up to the 2015. So knowing where they have been historically and where they are now, it just forms such an important component of management. The other thing that we're trying to achieve is encouraging habitat rest through the landscape. And then really important is the protection of hollow-bearing trees. But also, if we do have some old trees that have fallen, and you can see this is a property in Robertson and they had a tornado come through and that landholder has just left all of those fallen logs. That's really important habitat for quolls. It's also important habitat for other small mammals. So leaving that, not seeing that as a mess is really important for biodiversity. Also, all of this data and information feeds into the National Recovery Plan for the spotted tail quoll. And certainly there are a number of objectives that are listed in there, one of which is working with landholders specifically to try and achieve what we are hoping to achieve in this particular Wild Neighbours project. Here we go. One of the objectives, Objective 3, is to reduce the rate of habitat loss and fragmentation, specifically on private land. Partnerships. That's really important and cannot be overemphasised, that really it's a collaboration with the landholders, the researchers and the Landcare Network to impart knowledge about scientifically robust monitoring and having this really meaningful community learning. The scientific methods that we use, they're very simple, but they are very powerful, and the data that we get absolutely does inform management and conservation of these species. Okay, so how are we doing this? So we're now into the methods part. So your standard way to monitor for predators, and we call it a predator monitoring array, which means that you've almost like you overlay a grid pattern onto a landscape. And you have a series of cameras and bait cages, and you can see the camera there in the picture, and then just in front of that burnt log is a bait cage. In that bait cage, there's a chicken drumstick and a healthy dose of tuna oil. The animals cannot get to this bait, it's in that cage, but what it does is it rots over time and it produces quite the stench. And then it will bring in the different predators, both introduced and native. And then that particular camera will take a series of photo bursts, and from that we can then identify either the species or even the individual, and I'll talk a little bit about how we identify individuals. The second method that we use is the selfie trap. It's called the selfie trap because the way that it works is that there is a camera at one end of that particular tube. In the middle is a small little bait cage. Again, inside is what's called a herbivore mix, which is rolled oats, peanut butter and honey. And then in comes a sugar glider or an antechinus or a bush rat to investigate. And what you can get is a really nice picture of their face. And when my students were saying to me, oh, what should we call that? I said, it's like a selfie, isn't it? So it became the selfie trap. So when we go to have a look at species ID and then data analysis, this is the kind of data or images that we get. What we tend to follow are the guidelines by the New South Wales National Parks and their Saving Our Species program. They've got specific ways that they set up cameras for spotted tail quolls so that you are always taking a picture of the flank, one of the sides of the quoll. And the reason that we do that is so that we can have a look at the spot patterns, because every spotted tail quoll has a unique spot pattern. And so we can look at those different flanks and we can work out which individual we are looking at. So here is an image from the selfie trap, and you can see why I decided to call it the selfie trap, because you do get a really nice image of the species individual's face. This is data from the Lake Macquarie area where you have got an overlap between the coastal sugar glider and the squirrel glider. And so just looking at these two and seeing that the bait cages are of the same size, so that's your scale as well, who can tell me which one is a squirrel glider? On the right. Squirrel glider. Did anyone say left? On the left. So the squirrel glider is a lot bigger than the sugar glider, and you can see that difference is quite obvious in the picture. Some of you are going, is it? It is.
Would that be one of the reasons why the squirrel gliders tend to be pushing out some of the other gliders because they're bigger?
Yeah, absolutely. But also there's a lot of hybridisation happening too. So we find that particularly in that area, we've got a whole nother species, inverted commas, that are hybrids, and they're functional hybrids, which means that they are then going and mating back with either a sugar glider or a squirrel glider. So it's a little bit of a mess in terms of the taxonomy for them. But here's another good example of when you've got, say, an antechinus or a bush rat that comes. And the antechinus and the bush rat always trip us up if they're not in a selfie trap, they can trip you up because they do look quite similar, and it's only when you get that side profile that you can start to see those sort of characteristics of an antechinus that is in the same family as the spotted tail quoll. You can see those really pointy snouts and you can see their teeth and so on. But the other cool thing I want to mention is that we've got 5 different individual coastal sugar gliders that you can see here. What we also found was that they've got unique head stripe patterns, and so you can tell an individual by that head stripe. You can also tell a male because the male is a little bit bald and proud of it. Thank you very much. We have a lot to learn from the sugar glider. Very proud. So what the males do is they've got scent glands on their heads, and then they'll go and rub vigorously their heads onto various parts of their habitat. So you can even tell whether it's a male or a female sometimes from these photos too, if you see a bald patch. So deceptively simple equipment giving you really high quality data and information. And the only thing that an ecologist really wants to do in their whole career is count things. That's all we do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we count. And having the ability to count an individual without having to trap it is invaluable. Obviously, we tick the welfare box. We don't need to catch those animals. We don't need to interfere with them. We can set a camera, we can walk away, and they can carry on with their day, but we can get high quality information. So Once we've got our data in this project, what we're going to do is feed that into a dedicated Wild Neighbours iNaturalist project, and then we will sit down and interpret what that data means with the landholders. But certainly iNaturalist is a very powerful citizen science tool, and it's used extensively in the region by natural history groups as well. So that will be part of what we're doing. And now I can hear some of you saying, but you didn't even tell me what a quoll was. You haven't told me what a glider is, but okay, so that's what we're going to do. Okay, what I wanted to show you here was a video of one of the first quolls that we got in Barren Grounds, Butteroo. And this particular quoll was found by a citizen scientist by the name of Craig Murrell. This was in 2014. And what Craig recorded was really quite interesting. It was a series of videos of which the quoll is showing how agile it is. What I really wanted to show you is how good a climber they are. I often get questions about how could they possibly be preying on gliders and animals in hollows. They are absolutely an amazing climber, and this particular individual just absolutely just jumps around. So in terms of their distribution, historically had a really large distribution. They're still found in the wet tropics of Queensland, and then they come all the way down to Victoria. They're in Tasmania as well. As I said, we're really lucky in our local area because we have got stronghold populations. So in the National Recovery Plan, there's a series of stronghold populations that are listed, and certainly of those listed in New South Wales, the most occur here. So in Barren Grounds, Butteroo, and then Moreton. So again, really healthy habitat and certainly able to support. So their conservation status, nationally they're endangered, and in South Australia they're actually extinct, but they've got a funny system with their listing, so they don't really list extinct species, so they just say that they're endangered. Mostly because you might have some quolls wander over the border and come back. Animals don't really care about geopolitical borders, so it doesn't really make sense in terms of state boundaries, but so they just say that they're endangered there. In New South Wales, they're vulnerable. Tassie and Queensland the same. In ACT and Victoria, they're threatened. What those different categories mean is how quickly are these species moving towards extinction. So in New South Wales, we've got this medium risk that in 20 years' time, we're going to have a 20% chance that these animals will be extinct in New South Wales. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about conservation status and the different risks. So quolls are one of those species, and you can see tonight they get a lot of attention. They're very charismatic, they're a very interesting species. Certainly any time I've undertaken any quoll work, it's always made it into the media, either locally in the Illawarra Mercury or some work that I did with colleagues at the University of Newcastle and Watergan Mountains. We made it into the Newcastle Herald. But I wanted to go back through the archives, and so I wanted to see what were some of the earliest newspaper mentions of. And so this one is in the Illawarra Mercury from 1953. If you have a look at the date, it is in May, June, July. These are the dates or the months that you're going to see spotted tail quolls starting to move through the landscape, specifically the males, and they're looking for mates. Tiger cats captured at Albion Park. So a tiger cat was captured right in the centre of town at Albion Park after it had killed 4 fowls, the property of Mr. M. Walsh. Another one was caught at Mr. Len Anderson's farm, where it had killed 1 hen and 4 large chickens. Quolls and chickens, there's a recurring theme, and you probably know that too. So someone will invariably say the quolls are in the chicken pen. I get calls from people in suburban Wollongong saying that they have quolls in their chicken pens. So Mangaton, if any of you are familiar with Wollongong, then Kanahooka, is the other favourite place for quolls to turn up during the breeding season. And then there's this one, again, the Illawarra Mercury, but from 1922, so 100 years ago. And it says, a splendid specimen of tiger cat was shot by Mr. Ollie Wilson in Albion Park Showground on Wednesday. This member of the feline species is very rare. While it's being found so close to civilization is probably unique, the destruction of the cat is hoped to bring an end to frequent depredations on the poultry yards of several park residents who have been heavy losers in respect for several past weeks. I can tell you now that Albion Park residents are still heavy losers to spotted-tail quolls. I'm constantly being told about quolls running along back fences and eating chickens and so on. Very healthy population of quolls, jamboree, barren grounds and so on. Certainly it hasn't stopped and I hope it doesn't. I'm sad for the chickens, but it does go to show you that we have got them locally and have done for 100 years. So what I wanted to do here was just to bring up the BioNet records for the past 46 years. This is something that you can do yourself. You just log on to the New South Wales BioNet portal and then you can search by species, you can search by geographic region, and you can bring up the records of whatever species you are interested in. The really good thing about these BioNet records is that they are, for the most part, records that are collected under a scientific licence, which means that it's either a government scientist or a consultant or, say, a university researcher that has collected this sighting, which means that we have got some kind of hard data to demonstrate that this is a... What you can see is that there is one particular part of the area that they are moving through, which has been called and is known as the thin green line. And if we overlay, and what you can see is, you can see Moreton there, connected to barren grounds and Butteroos in between there. And then you've got that thin green line, and it is connecting basically to the lower Blue Mountains, national parks and all this area. So that is the network or the corridor that is being used by spotted-tail quolls. And if we overlay the records, certainly you can see that is the case where they're being seen. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about gliders. Again, quite fortunate in our local area to have the southern greater glider, but then also we've got sugar gliders. And I say sugar gliders, inverted commas, because the sugar glider researchers are in the middle of revising the taxonomy and revising the distribution and so on of the different species. So at the moment we can call them sugar gliders, but certainly there's been recent work to show that now we've got distributions of, we know where the coastal sugar glider is versus the Crefts glider and so on. So, but for our purposes, we'll call it the sugar glider. So let's start with the greater glider. It was only about, I think, 2022 when we learnt that actually the greater glider is now 3 different species. And in our region, we have the southern greater glider. And this is an example of one from 7 Mile Beach National Park. So again, a fairly local individual there. They are endangered. They were uplisted to endangered after the 2019-2020 bushfires. A lot of their habitat got wiped out and certainly a lot of the animals perished as well in those devastating fires. Some key information about them. They've got fairly smallish home ranges, and that's if they're in really high quality habitat. If they're in not so great habitat, then they've got a lot bigger home ranges. And then this is where we start getting into human-wildlife conflict. When they are in patches that are quite fragmented and they need to cross into these patches, then we start getting death related to barbed wire. We get road strikes and so on. They don't usually come onto the ground, though we have had instances on private properties in the area, in the Berry area, where they have come to the ground. Usually they're old, they're infirm, perhaps they can't see, and so one came to the ground and was grazing on some grass. but it is very rare that a glider will come to the ground. They have got pretty big glide distances, but having said that, again, they're all individuals, and we find that at 7 Mile Beach National Park, where we've been there for over 10 years now, we find they rarely glide. They much prefer just climbing through the canopy and reaching across. If they have to glide, they will, but if they're in that sort of really high quality habitat, we don't find that they're doing too much gliding. They very much rely on old growth trees. Old growth trees have got larger hollows. Trees of about 50 to 70 years, they start forming their hollows, but they've got small hollows. They're probably for the smaller gliding species, but certainly those older trees, older hollows, and that's where you will find gliders. The last part of that just said that, look, there's reports of them using anywhere up to 19 different hollows. Certainly more than 5 is hollows that one glider will use is standard for the species. This impressed me immensely because this wouldn't have looked like this probably 3 years ago. What you're seeing here is a massive effort from national parks and then Department of Environment. They keep changing their name, so I'll just call them Department of Environment. But what they've done in the last few years is drone surveys for koalas. Some work that's come out of my own lab shows that if you've got a koala, you're very likely to have a greater glider. So these records, these gliders are benefiting from the fact that drones have been flown for koalas, but staff are also logging all of the greater glider sightings as well. As I said, this is only in the last 20 years, but certainly in the last 2 to 3 years, we've got some really high quality data from drones, and that's gone into Bionet. So we've got a really good idea of where our southern greater gliders are in the area. Okay, so moving on to sugar gliders. They once being probably only about 3 years ago, and if you have a look at any sort of field guide, you'll see sugar gliders, their distribution stretches all the way from the Northern Territory round all the way to the East Coast and all the way down. What we now know is that, no, that's multiple different species. The species that we have specifically on the South Coast, that's actually the sugar glider. One of my colleagues from Southern Cross Uni, he now calls it the coastal sugar glider. So, okay, we will respect that. We'll call it the coastal sugar glider. But that Petoris breviceps, which we thought everything was Petoris breviceps, that truly is on the south coast of New South Wales. So very special to have that species here. This work comes from my lab and it's of Megan Powley. And what Megan did was went and measured every single sugar glider, inverted commas, specimen held in Australian museums and measured their jaw, measured their head and so on, and compared all of these different morphometrics of these species to come up with a new or a revised distribution. So likely what we have here is the Crafts glider, and then as we move on the coast, we've got the sugar glider, coastal sugar glider, but also we're probably in this hybrid zone as well. So that's why we just say sugar glider for our purposes. But you can see the sugar glider there from one of our selfie traps. So again, these species are quite scrappy. I really like them. They're really tenacious. They'll happily live in a tree hollow. They'll happily live on the ground under a log in some roots of something. They'll live in a nest box. They're really not a very picky species. They are highly mobile. They will travel on the ground. They will glide. They'll do whatever. They can have up to 5 different hollows, but then if you give them nest boxes, they'll use the hollows and the nest boxes and so on. They're really, for me, quite a charismatic and fun species to study. And certainly watching them on camera, they tend to get into fights with each other or other species on camera, and they're quite a funny species to look at. They're very small. They're probably only 100 grams average size, sometimes smaller. And you can see just the comparison of the glider in somebody's hand, just how quite small they are. But having said that, they are not delicate. They're very tenacious and quite a lot of spunk in them. Again, if we look at the BioNet records for the past 20 years of sugar gliders, quite healthy. Again, some of this data comes from the drone images that have been produced. But then also this is a species that a lot of landholders tend to just see because they are so mobile and so active. Also you can hear them, they yap, they're quite vocal. And so in that respect, they tend to be a species that is a little bit more on people's radars. So how can you help to protect these species? What we can do is you can protect what's already there. Sometimes doing nothing is the best thing that you can do. So if, you have got fallen logs, leaf litter, dense shrubs on your property, leave it. If you have got some old hollow-bearing trees, again, leave them. You can fence off remnant vegetation and creek lines, and I know certainly down in the Shoalhaven Landcare, they have got quite a lot of properties where they have projects where they're fencing off creek lines and watching and then monitoring that over the years and really showing the benefit to conservation having that. Avoid tidying up too much. That's hard because I also love a nice garden, but the messier the better. Really, in ecological terminology, messy is called complex. So we talk about complex habitat, that's messy habitat, but it has really high biodiversity value. And you can see myself, Gay, Louise and Christine visited a property locally, and honestly, it was the most complex habitat I've seen in quite a while. Code word for. But yeah, it was great. The property owner said no plans to clean this up. It was knocked down by a tornado and it's going to stay that way. And it was wonderful to see, absolutely was. So the other way that you can help is to add structural habitat. Okay, so structural elements into your existing patches that you're conserving. That means putting in species-appropriate nest boxes. And certainly my advice with nest boxes is to be quite careful about what nest box you're going to put up and making sure that you put the correct nest box for the correct species. Certainly greater gliders, they're very sensitive to heat. So that particular box that you can see there, it's set at 8 metres and above, so it's very high up. You need a tree climber to install it, but that is thermally insulated. It's painted with a special protective coating and so on, and that is so that it has got a thermal, it's got a stable temperature inside at all times. So if you are going down that route, don't just put up any old box. Make sure that you have got the right box for the right species and that you pay attention to those thermal properties. It's really important because you don't want those animals to overheat, basically. You can create your own brush piles or rock piles for reptiles and small mammals. And then you can leave dead standing timber or stags, obviously, if it's safe to do. So there are small things that you can do. Other things that you can do, people often ask me, what can I do? I don't own a property. I say to them, if you're driving at night in an area near a national park or somewhere where it's a little bit more habitat, in rural areas, slow down a little bit. Dusk and dawn, just slow down. That helps immensely. If you're fond of putting a spotlight on your big fig tree, turn it off at a particular hour so that the fruit bats can come. It's these kind of small actions that we can take to help. Importantly, everything that I've spoken about tonight, data that we collect, they will and they do feed back into the National Recovery Plan for spotted tail quolls. And certainly Objective 3, and I'll just quickly tell you that each objective in a recovery plan comes with a priority. And you've got high, medium, low. You can see that working with landholders, private landholders, to reduce the rate of habitat loss, that's a high priority. So these kind of actions are taken very seriously by natural resource managers because they're of such importance to the conservation of this species. So if you did want to get involved, you can speak to any one of us. Also feel free to come and have a look at these specimens down the front. So this is a southern greater glider, just so you get an idea of the size of the animals. And then we've got a spotted tail quoll with a rosella as well, so you can have a good look at them. We've got some really good brochures here on the table. This one was put out a little while ago by the Saving Our Species group, but what it does is it gives you ideas on how to quoll-proof your chook pen. And certainly we don't want to be like Mr. Len Anderson from Albion Park 100 years ago who did something to the quolls. So he could have proofed his chook pen. We know better, so we'll do better now. But yeah, certainly have a look at some of the information that's there. And that's it from me.